To think you know Henry VIII, the guy with 6 wives who founded the Church of England. Well, buckle up, because the real Henry VIII was so much worse than any history textbook dares to tell you. A king so grotesquely obese that he needed mechanical devices just to move around. A man whose rotting leg wounds smelled so horrific that servants would literally run away, gagging. A ruler whose own body was falling apart so dramatically that his coffin exploded from the gases of his decomposing corpse. And yet, this wasn't even the darkest part. You're about to uncover the shocking truths about Henry VIII that make Game of Thrones look like a children's fairy tale. From bizarre eating rituals to paranoid security measures, from twisted betrayals of his wives to the grotesque nightmare of his final years, these are the facts that will change everything you thought you knew about England's most infamous king. His body was a walking disaster. By the end of his life, Henry VIII was no longer just a man. He was a walking corpse. His waist measured 54 inches, bigger than most people are tall. He weighed nearly 400 pounds, in an era when the average man weighed 140. But here's the truly horrifying part. It wasn't just his size. His legs were covered in festering open wounds that oozed pus day and night. These weren't scratches. These were craters of rotting flesh, wounds so deep they never healed. The stench was so overwhelming that courtiers pressed perfumed cloths to their noses before daring to approach. Some said you could smell the king from several rooms away. Servants drew straws to see who had to dress him, because being near those ulcers was considered a punishment worse than the dungeon. But it gets darker. In 1536, Henry was thrown from his horse in a jousting accident. He lay unconscious for 2 hours, 2 hours when people thought the king was already dead. That brain injury changed everything. It warped his mind, twisted his temper, and transformed him from a proud young ruler into a paranoid, rage-filled monster. And then, perhaps Cushing's syndrome sealed his fate, causing wild mood swings, uncontrollable weight gain, and those nightmarish ulcers that reeked of death itself. Doctors whispered of his decline, but dared not speak aloud. To criticize the king's health was treason. Imagine an entire court terrified into silence as their ruler slowly rotted in front of them. By his final years, Henry couldn't even control his own bowels. He had to be carried on special chairs, terrified of soiling himself in public. Yet this same man, weak, broken, diseased, still executed people for merely glancing at him the wrong way. The wives had it even worse. Everyone knows Henry had 6 wives. Everyone knows 2 were executed. But what those women endured was closer to psychological torture than marriage. Take Anne Boleyn. Before her beheading, Henry didn't simply order her death. He staged an elaborate frame-up, forcing her own musician to confess under brutal torture. And then, the truly sick part, Anne was made to watch as 5 men, including her own brother, were executed for alleged affairs with her. She stood, trembling, watching innocent blood spill, knowing she was next. Catherine Howard suffered an even crueler fate. Barely a teenager, she was married off to a king old enough to be her grandfather. When Henry discovered her past relationships, he didn't just kill her, he rewrote the law, declaring it treason for anyone to marry the king without confessing their sexual history. His pettiness wasn't just personal, it became law. Catherine of Aragon, banished, locked away, forbidden from seeing her daughter. She died alone, perhaps poisoned, writing desperate letters to a husband who never read them. And Jane Seymour, the so-called lucky one. She died giving Henry his longed-for son, but Henry wasted no time mourning. 9 days after her funeral, he was already planning his next marriage. Anne of Cleves escaped only by signing a humiliating annulment, pretending their marriage never happened, and thanking Henry for sparing her life. Imagine being forced to thank your executioner for deciding not to kill you. Henry's wives were pawns, and pawns in his game were disposable. Escape was impossible. Divorce meant disgrace. Running meant death. Resistance meant not only your own execution, but the destruction of your entire family line. His eating habits were a horror show. If you think competitive eating contests today are shocking, wait until you hear what Henry VIII consumed in a single day. He ate like he was trying to devour the kingdom itself. 5,000 calories daily, double what a grown soldier should eat. Entire roasted pigs, multiple whole chickens. Heaps of fish, mountains of bread, wine poured like rivers. His kitchens prepared 800 dishes a day, an endless parade of food for a man who could barely walk. He didn't just eat meals. He staged feasts like theatrical performances. The act of eating became a grotesque ritual, an emperor consuming until the table itself groaned under the weight. And this is only the beginning, because behind the feasts, behind the marriages, behind the stench of disease and paranoia, lurks a king who ruled through fear, a man both larger than life and already half dead, a man whose name would forever echo through history, not for glory, but for terror. The royal kitchens employed over 200 people working around the clock to keep up with Henry's monstrous appetite. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Henry was convinced certain foods had magical powers. He believed swan would give him grace. Deer would sharpen his hunting skills. Oysters would boost his performance with his wives. So he gorged himself on these so-called enchanted foods, as if stuffing his body with magic could mask the rot eating him from the inside. But his obsession went beyond superstition. It became ritual. Every single bite that entered his mouth was first tested by multiple servants. And Henry's paranoia was so extreme that tasters had to wait a full half-hour before he'd touch a single morsel, just in case the poison was slow-acting. Imagine the tension. Dozens of eyes on a servant waiting, wondering if he'd collapse before the king even lifted his fork. Henry's meals weren't dinners. They were performances of power. He would sit, swollen and decaying, while hundreds of courtiers watched in silence as he devoured enough food to feed an entire village. Hours would pass, the hall reeking of roasted meats and wine, as the king's body groaned under the weight of his gluttony. And yet, he banned simple foods like turnips and barley, not because they were unhealthy, but because they were beneath him. The irony? The foods he outlawed could have saved his health. Instead, he drowned himself in sugar and meat, convinced that his royal blood made him untouchable, even as his own flesh rotted away. The paranoia that ruled an empire. Henry's paranoia was not ordinary suspicion. It was a contagion, a madness that turned his kingdom into a nightmare of shadows and spies. He slept with loaded crossbows by his bed, daggers under his pillow, and guards inside his chamber watching his every breath. Imagine the fear. A king so terrified of betrayal he could not even close his eyes without witnesses to guard his dreams. And the palaces, they became fortresses of fear. Secret passages snaked through every residence, not for pleasure, but for escape. Peepholes were cut into walls, so Henry could spy on his courtiers. Whispering tubes and primitive listening devices carried voices from private chambers straight to the king's ears. But the most twisted part? Henry built a network of spies whose only task was to spy on the other spies. Layers upon layers of deceit, until no one knew who was loyal and who was bait for the executioner's axe. Court life became a silent horror show, where a single misplaced word could mean death, not tomorrow, but tonight. His paranoia infected everything. Meals became military operations, sealed kitchens guarded like prisons, spices and water tested for poison, servants watched like criminals. And he even suspected his own blood, Princess Mary, Princess Elizabeth, his daughters. He treated children like traitors, watching them as if they plotted murder in the nursery. Henry didn't just punish betrayal, he punished dreams. If he dreamed someone turned against him, they died. If someone whispered they might turn disloyal one day, heads rolled before the thought even existed. The Tower of London overflowed with prisoners whose only crime was breathing in the same air as a paranoid king. And soon, nobles and servants alike began betraying each other, feeding the hysteria, desperate to survive. Death couldn't even stop the chaos. You'd think Henry VIII's reign of terror ended with his final breath, but even death could not contain the disaster that was his body. In his final weeks, he could no longer walk. Servants hauled him around in a special chair, wheels creaking, pulleys straining under the weight, and as they carried him, pieces of rotting flesh fell off, leaving a trail of their king behind. Imagine the horror of following him, rags in hand, to clean up the chunks of a decomposing monarch. By the time death came, Henry's body was grotesque beyond imagination. Swollen, stretched, glistening with decay. The stench was so unbearable that even his doctors, men hardened by medieval horrors, vomited and fled the room. But that was only the beginning. His corpse swelled with gases, bloating until the coffin itself strained under the pressure. They wrapped him in lead, sealed him in wood, but nothing could contain the horror brewing inside. During the funeral procession, it happened. The coffin exploded. Rotten flesh, royal fluids, and the stench of death burst forth. Servants scrambled with rags and buckets to mop up what was left of their king. And then dogs appeared, lapping up the leaking remains of the man who once declared himself God's chosen ruler, Henry IV, eaten by dogs on an English road. Even his burial was chaos. The grave collapsed beneath his weight. The soil rejected him. His tomb became a source of whispers, strange noises, foul odors leaking for years after, as if his spirit, or perhaps just more gases, refused to stay buried. And the final curse: several servants who handled his bloated corpse died within weeks. Infection, poisoned air, or something darker, clinging to the remains of a man who lived and ruled like a monster. So, there you have it. Not the charming king of paintings and pop culture, but a grotesque tyrant, rotting from within, whose paranoia turned a kingdom into a prison, and whose death turned his body into a nightmare. Henry VIII's true legacy is not the Church of England or his 6 wives. It is proof of how absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it decays, until the man who ruled an empire became a prisoner of his own flesh, his own madness, and his own legend. If these disturbing truths made you question everything you thought you knew about history, hit subscribe, because trust me, you haven't heard anything yet.